did you find like happiness and joy in Islam, or did it seem like something you just really needed to be a part of in order to fit in with everybody else? Maybe a mix of both?
I think that's a really good question because what I found was, and I really understood this after I left, that with religions like Islam, and I would say it's true to pretty much any major organized religion, is there's the good stuff and then there's the bad stuff.
The proceeds of this monetized episode are going towards I Am Dying Out Loud. Find out more in the description. Aleem, thank you so much for joining me on Growing Up Fundie. I really appreciate having you here today. Thank you for giving your time to my channel and my listeners.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be on the channel. And as I mentioned to you when we first connected, I did check out your interview of Aaron Ra, and that was really interesting. I've been a big fan of his for a long time, so it's cool to be a guest as well on a channel with that kind of company.
Well, thank you so much. I knew that I had to have you on my channel when you were recommended to me by Secular Rarity because he and I think
I
we're on like
love
the
secular
same.
rarity.
Yes, and we're on like the same brain wave. So his friends, I consider friends, and I'm just stoked to have you. But enough from me. Tell us a little bit about what you're here to talk about today. Your backstory, which is a super interesting one, and yeah, just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, there's something a little interesting about my experience of growing up Muslim, which I'll get to in a bit, but I'll just give you the
Mm.
preamble first. So, my background's Palestinian, and I grew up in Dubai, the United Arab
Oh
Emirates.
wow, yeah.
Yeah. So, what was interesting about my childhood early on was I actually lived in Canada for a while when I was really young. And I would describe my family in that point as we were, religious, but it wasn't really a big part of our lives. We would just say, well, we're Muslim and we'd celebrate the big Muslim holidays.
Yeah.
And then we moved to the Middle East. And
Oh, interesting.
and in the United Arab Emirates, in a lot of the schools, if you're Muslim, you have to take something called Islamic education. And the best way to think about it is it's like a subject like math or English. So you have English class and then you have Islamic education class.
Interesting.
And so when I came to Dubai, I was around 7 or 8 years old. I was pretty westernized at this point. My English was almost as good or even better than my Arabic, and I noticed right away I was very different than a lot of the kids around me.
Yeah.
And I think I started having the sense of inadequacy about myself because of that.
Oh,
I was definitely a misfit. It was very obvious
yeah.
early on. And uh, there was this one day, I always remember this day, and I've shared this story on my channel a few times, where our Islamic education teacher told us, well, we're going to do something special this week. We're going to go to the school mosque and we're going to pray together. And I went into panic mode because I realized, oh, shoot, I don't know how to pray. I was never taught.
Oh, wow.
So, for your viewers who might not know, prayer is a pretty big thing in Islam, mainly because you have to do it 5 times a day. So it's a very regular occurrence, and there's a lot of steps to it. It's not just like a quick prayer you say.
Right.
There's a whole bunch of movements and then
Wow.
things you're supposed to say, and I knew none of it. And so 8-year-old me rushed back home knowing that, oh my God, if I go to school tomorrow and I don't know how to pray, it's going to be humiliating.
Yeah.
And
And
so I
would it
went to my
also have
parents.
been dangerous for you or just embarrassing?
I, I didn't think about that. I mean, it was dangerous in the sense of, will I go to hell because I don't know how to pray? But
Yeah.
that's the theme later. We're going to get into that. Yeah.
Yeah.
At this point, I was just afraid of the social humiliation.
Mm.
And so I rushed home to my parents, and to my shock and surprise, they both didn't know how to pray either. I was like, what? How can they possibly not know?
What?
So at this
Yeah.
point, I knew all of the basic things, but I didn't know the religion that well. I knew that God created me, God loves me, and we owe everything to Him. And at the end, we go to heaven, paradise, and we're there with all our loved ones. So I
Wow.
didn't really know anything more beyond that, really. And it just surprised me. Why wouldn't they want to pray to this God who gave us everything?
Yeah.
And I just thought, oh, they're just lazy, because praying 5 times a day is pretty hard.
It
It's
is.
very hard to
It
keep
is.
doing anything 5 times a day on a regular
Right.
basis. Is hard to do. And so what I managed to do was, I have a younger brother, and he was a couple grades beneath me, and they actually had this little illustrated book with all the steps you could learn. And I just scrambled and memorized everything and practiced all the moves and spent the whole night doing that, pretty much.
Wow.
Uh, Motivated by fear,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
going to be a recurring theme in my Muslim experience.
Yeah.
And so managed to learn enough to pass the next day, and no one noticed that I wasn't really able to do certain
Wow.
things, and I basically was able to fake my way through it, and I learned enough to just be able to do the rest. And after that, I knew how to pray, pretty much. And
Wow.
this was, I would say, the first step of my relationship with Islam, where I had this feeling of inadequacy, that I don't fit in, and this is the best way where I can show that I belong. And this is something I wanted to talk to you about as well. And maybe this is something that's a little bit different for Christians in the
Mhm.
West, depending on where they live in. I think there's some exceptions, but generally speaking, I think when you're Muslim, uh, your culture, whether you're from an Arab country like I am, or you're from the Indian subcontinent, or a country like Indonesia, for example, there's a lot of Muslims.
Mhm.
Islam is really a big part of your
Yes.
day-to-day life, of your
Yes.
heritage, your traditions, what people do together. So there's the 5 prayers a day. You're also supposed to go to a mosque every Friday. There's a bunch of different celebrations, annual ones,
Yes.
and it's interwoven even in our day-to-day speech, like saying thank you God, alhamdulillah, is something you say all the time.
Yep. Same.
Saying,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So there's a lot of similarities in that sense, but it's just really embedded in the culture.
Yeah.
And because it wasn't really a big part of my life when I was living in Canada, I felt like I was always playing catch up in that sense and many other senses.
Interesting. I understand to an extent what you're describing. So I am from Arkansas. I'm from the South in the United States, and I feel like at this point the whole world knows that the American South is where the religious Christian people are, and so it's very similar. Where even though we have separation of church and state in our country, supposedly, if you ask the forefathers, it's genuinely expected of you to be Christian and act Christian and say Christian things and do Christian things. And you're not really allowed to not do that. Like you cannot participate, but people notice and they comment. And if you have an issue with Christian things happening, if you're like, hey, like I'm not a Christian, I'd rather we not do that, you are the problem. So nobody's out here telling you you have to be Christian, but you get the idea by existing in that culture long enough. You get the idea that, oh, I'll pray for you. I'll lay hands and pray for you, or it's in God's hands, or God has a reason for everything. And you don't realize how embedded it is in the culture until you want to leave Christianity. And then you're like, wow, so much of what we do is just Christianity. Um,
Revolving around that, yeah. And when you're a
yeah,
kid, you really absorb that stuff as a sponge,
definitely.
like a sponge, right? Like
Yep.
like you're
Yep.
absorbing everything else.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so did you find like happiness and joy in Islam, or did it seem like something you just really needed to be a part of in order to fit in with everybody else? Maybe a mix of both?
I think that's a really good question, because what I found was, and I really understood this after I left, that with religions like Islam, and I would say it's true to pretty much any major organized religion, is there's the good stuff, and then there's the bad stuff. And the way that really came to me, I think, early on, was I learned about how God loves us, and there's this paradise, and you know, I remember feeling this sense of harmony and peace, thinking that there's this God who loves me, who has a plan for me, and
Mhm.
how I'm never alone.
Yeah.
But then there was this other side to it. You're never alone.
Never. Yeah.
So so God's always watching you. And the
Yep.
reason that's important is because God has all these rules, all these commands you're supposed to follow. And if you break those rules, if you break enough of them, well, you're sinning. And if you sin, so there's paradise, but then there's hell. And I found that that's how Islam works. it's almost like the like how they describe the carrot and stick approach. Well, you got the carrot, but then there's that stick to threaten you as well. And by the way, I was learning all this stuff in school. So we were being
Wow.
taught about hell and demons and the devil and what the devil will do to us and how the devil is constantly seducing us into sin and how the devil is always around us.
Yeah.
I mean, God is always around us too. So that's a part I never really quite understood as a kid. Why is God allowing the devil to do all this? The explanation I eventually learned a little bit older is that life is a test. And so I
Mm,
started seeing my entire life this way. Like there's all these temptations. There's all these
yes.
things that I want to do, but I shouldn't because I need to get into paradise, which is for eternity, because I don't want to end up in hell for eternity. And as I got older, the fear started growing because I started having these feelings that I knew were inappropriate. And specifically when it came around the subject of sexuality.
Hmm.
Once I started hitting puberty and I started feeling attracted to women, and in Islam, anything outside of sex, outside of marriage, is a big no-no.
Wow. Yeah.
And I started feeling guilty for looking at, say, like a teacher in school in a way that I felt was very, very, very inappropriate. If I looked at like women on the street or something like that, and that guilt really carried with me because I couldn't help feeling that way.
Right.
And I
It's
always
just
had
a
this confusion.
biological response. Yeah.
Yeah, and there was this confusion of like, why am I feeling this way when I'm not supposed to? And it came back to me like, this is a test. This is a test. This is a test. And it really reached a point where I was constantly fearful of. I think the same kind of thing exists in Christianity, the concept of judgment day at the end
Yep.
times. So we
Yep.
have pretty much the same thing. So what I learned was this horn would sound, and everyone, and this would be after a lot of calamitous things would
Yes.
start happening on Earth. People dying, massacres, instability, um, extreme weather events, and then everybody would die when this horn sounds, and then that would be the time of judgment. And so I
Yep.
remember as a kid being terrified if I ever heard like a really loud noise. Maybe it's just like a
Oh
truck
no.
honking. Thinking, oh my
Yeah.
God, no, I haven't done enough good deeds. I remember having these thoughts when I was like 12, 13.
Wow.
And one of the signs of Judgment Day was that there would be more droughts, like there would be droughts worldwide. So I didn't remember this, but my mom told me this years later that there was this one time I rushed home from school. I ran up and I turned on the TV to look at the weather report. And my parents were like, "Why, are you so interested in the weather report?" And I was just looking to see if it was raining somewhere in the world. Once I saw it was raining in this
Oh,
country or that country, I was like, "Phew, oh
that's
my
so
God."
traumatic. That's
Mhm.
so traumatic. And did your parents have any, or at least do you remember them having any like major concerns about how deeply you were taking religion? Or did they just kind of let you do your thing? What was their response to all this?
They, I would say they had a hands-off approach with me directly. They would say things like, "We love you, you're safe," and stuff like that. But I kind of hid, for the most part, my fears and insecurities from them. One reason was because I was ashamed that I had these sinful thoughts and ideas. I mean, it was very
Yeah.
often to talk to my mom say about, well, I'm lusting after this teacher and this person and that person.
Yeah.
And it was also because I felt like they didn't know better than me. I felt like I was a better Muslim than them because at least I prayed,
Yeah.
I I fasted during Ramadan, which is one of the big things you do when you're Muslim, and my
Mhm.
parents didn't fast. And I started thinking, oh, they're just kind of like how you have like lapsed Catholics. I've heard
Yeah.
that term before. But oh,
Yeah.
they're just lapsed, lazy Muslims, and they're probably going to hell. I remember thinking that about my parents for a very long time.
Wow.
And so for a lot of things, when they would tell me, no, you shouldn't think this way, or no, this isn't appropriate, or you know, you can relax about this, I thought, well, they don't know what they're talking about because I'm listening to what my teachers are saying in school, and they know
Yeah.
definitely way more than my parents. And so, in that sense, for the rest of my life, in other aspects of my life, I really listened to my parents when it came to the subject of religion, and I would say in a weird way, the most important things in life, like how you should behave, what you should do, what you shouldn't do. I really listened to my teachers a lot. And I later found out years later that my parents would often call the school to complain about my teachers, like my Islamic
Yeah.
education teachers, because they would be saying things like, what we're gonna suffer in hell. And I remember one classic thing my teacher said was, the reason society is corrupted is because women have been allowed into the workforce. So
What?
just casually say things like that. I don't even know how that subject would even come up in his classes, but
Yeah.
they would. He would be
Yeah.
basically be voicing his own opinion. Now it's debatable how much of that is part of the mainstream Islamic opinion or not, but that's the kind of stuff I grew up around learning.
Right.
The irony being that
Wow.
we all knew that his wife was a teacher in the school as well. So violating this rule he had, maybe he had some sort of way of rationalizing that. But yes,
That's
so that was the
wild.
dynamic I had growing up, where
Yeah.
my parents were actually concerned, but they'd only see little snippets of how it was impacting me. And for example, that anecdote I mentioned to you, where I'm frantically checking the weather.
Yeah. And did they, what was the reason they left Canada and went back?
Very simple. I mean, I think it's a very common thing for the immigrant experience. My parents had pretty decent, high-paying jobs in the Middle East before they moved to Canada initially, and when they got to Canada, they couldn't get any decent jobs. So
Interesting.
they were just scraping by, doing the bare minimum. And after we got citizenship in Canada, they were like, we can't keep doing this. They
Yeah.
were working very low-end jobs. My father was like a high-level manager, and he was working as a line cook in a sports bar. He was handing out
Wow.
flyers on the street. That's all he could do. I guess if we moved today, my dad would probably be an Uber driver, but we
Wow.
didn't even have that opportunity back then.
Yeah.
So very limited opportunities. So
That
they just
makes
decided
sense.
to go back.
And so, at what point did you start to really question things? At what point did you go from being that devout and it sounds like consistently aware of religion, faith, God, to not so sure anymore that that was true or that was what you wanted to do with your life?
Well, we've now arrived at my I don't know what to call it, my emo phase, my depression phase. So this is around when I was 16, almost done high school, and my parents always had this plan for me to move back to Canada for university. And I started having all these big questions of what do I do with my life? Like school is over, I have to pick something to do for my program in university.
Yeah.
I'm moving all the way to this other part of the world. What am I going to do there alone? Uprooting myself like this, and I had no answers to those questions. I was wondering, why am I doing all this? There's
Yeah.
nothing I would say that was really a passion that I wanted to pursue at that point. It just felt like, well, you've aged out, so now you just have to move out.
You just got to go
That's
back to
really how it
Canada.
felt.
Sorry. See ya.
Yeah, yeah. And because of that, I just started questioning everything around me, I think. Uh, my dad used to call it my why phase, because I'd always ask questions like why go to school, why do this, why work, why buy a house, why get married, all these things that are supposed to be the steps in life that are supposed to fulfill you and satisfy you. They just felt daunting, and they didn't feel like things that I wanted to do, but things that I was expected to do.
Mm.
And I think what happened was that because I was questioning all these things, I started wondering, well, why isn't Islam giving me the comfort it should? Because if you look to Islam, it tells you why you're here. You're here to worship God. You're here to be part of His love, and then the point of life is to do God's will, and then you join Him in paradise. This is life.
Yeah. Yep.
And I started wondering, why is that not working for me? And I couldn't really grasp why, because I think at that point I didn't even have the critical thinking ability to just question the possibility that Islam was not true.
Yeah.
It didn't even occur to me. It was just something that was so foundational, like water is wet and fire is hot, that God is real and God loves me. But I think once I moved to Canada and I was away from all my, my community, my safety networks, and it was just me alone, and I had to find the motivation to just get up in the morning and go to my classes, that I really had to confront those questions.
And what did you find, or what was it that finally was the answer you needed, where you were like, I can't look away from this now. Now that I've seen it, I'll never unsee
Yeah.
it.
Well, I think what happened was, and it wasn't something overnight, but it was, I would say, like a
Yeah.
gradual
Gradual.
process where I started thinking about what is me, what is what I want, and what is something that has been thrust upon me, something that has been imposed on me. because that's what I felt like at that point in my life. It was imposed on me to go to school.
Yeah.
It was imposed on me to move to Canada. It was imposed on me to pick the degree that I eventually picked, which I'm not in that field anymore at all. So I eventually left that. So this was like the first stepping stone of me finding who I am. And I realized with all these things that were imposed on me, I started realizing, what if Islam is this thing that's imposed on me? Because I just really broke it down. Like, how do I know it's true? This thing that I've carried with me my whole life. I've never seen this God.
Right.
There were times, especially when I was praying, where I thought I felt something. But then I started questioning that feeling. Like, could I have put that feeling inside me? And I started thinking about things like, one of the things that's pretty controversial about Islam is its view on things like homosexuality and the LGBTQ community in general. And when I was a kid, and I'm like really embarrassed to admit this now, but I used to find like just the image of two men kissing repulsive. I used to think that was disgusting. I used to make jokes about homosexuality all the time, and I thought it was like a repugnant sin. And I started thinking about that. Like, why do I believe that? Well, if you just listen to the teachings, well, because it's a sin. Well, why is it a sin? I think this is the thing that changed me. For a lot of Muslims, they stop there. They don't question beyond that. They just go to the point, well, God says so. Or because it's a sin. It's a sin because it's a sin, that kind of circular logic.
Right.
And I started thinking beyond that. And I realized I didn't have an answer to that question. And I didn't have an answer to a lot of questions. There's a lot of things when I started thinking about it, the justification was because God said so.
Yeah.
Or we're too ignorant to understand because we're very limited human beings, but God knows. Trust in God's plan. Can you see all the similarities
Yes.
between this and Christianity?
Yes. Yes. 100%. Especially when you were talking about being embarrassed of a lot of the things that you used to do and say in the name of being religious, right? And I think that's one of the hardest and, in my opinion, most gratifying parts of deconstruction is being able to say out loud what it was that you did and ask people to forgive you for it. And it's almost ironic because religion is all about ask forgiveness, you better get forgiven, you better pay penance. And I found that I was more sincerely asking forgiveness after I had left religion because, like you said, so much of what we believe and what we think we believe, when you really start asking yourself, why do you believe that? Where did you get that? Where's the evidence to support that? The answer always boils down to somebody told me, usually like a parent or a religious leader, they told me that was the case, or the Bible says so. And at least in the Bible, most of that is also bullshit. Like most of what we're told, oh, well, the Bible says this, it actually doesn't. Just so many religious Christians have never read the Bible. They're, again, just parroting what they're told. Well,
Well,
in
it's
the
a really
pulpit, they
long
say that.
book. Can you blame them?
Yeah, yeah. It's like, listen, I haven't read many books in a while, let alone the Bible. But yeah, it's and so I think that's one of the most important parts is being able to say that upon reflection and be like, yes, I did that. And I'm not proud of that, but I've changed. And that's like the door to freedom almost.
It's a scary thing to do, though,
Very scary.
because see, that's the thing that happened once I started questioning all this stuff. That I really had to follow. Like, I couldn't help it. This was the thing about me, and I think it probably still exists within me today. Once I start a chain of thought, I have to follow where it goes, even if it
Yes.
leads to
The rabbit
uncomfortable
hole.
places.
Yeah.
I have to go down into that rabbit hole. And what I realized was, if I'm questioning God, then I'm questioning whether there's an afterlife or not. I'm questioning if there's a point to anything at all, if there's a meaning to life, or if we're just here and then we die and then that's it. And I think what really kept me believing at this point, and probably what worked for me and a lot of other people, is what religion gives you is this sense of comfort and the sense of certainty. I'm sure you've encountered religious people who they don't worry about death. Like, I mean, they worry about death in the sense that they don't want to die, but they're
Yeah.
not scared
Right.
of what's going to happen next because they have the love of the Lord.
Yes.
Um, and they know, and when like a loved one dies, they're upset, but they take comfort in the fact that they're going to see that loved person
Yes.
again.
And that person is watching them only in the
Yes.
appropriate moments, apparently. Not all the time,
Yeah,
just when it's
yeah, of
appropriate, but
course.
they're
Well,
watching and they're proud.
they're busy. They've got Netflix up there and free Netflix. Yeah. So it was really hard for me to let go of those things, and then I started thinking, why is it hard for me to let go of these things? There's this thing, actually, I can't take credit for this. Actually, something that was said by Matt Dillahunty of the Atheist Experience, who I discovered years later on. Maybe we could talk about this a little bit later. I'm a little bit mixed on him and his approach, especially dealing with religious people and all
Yes.
that. But
Yes.
I found that he had a lot of really great ways of explaining things. And one thing he said was, imagine you're told your whole life that you're going to get, I don't know, $10 million when you're 30 years old. You're going to live your life a certain way because you're expecting that money. Maybe you don't go to school. Maybe the relationships you create in your life, the ones that you cultivate, are different. And then you hit 30, and then you find out that you're not getting $10 million. And of course, you're going to be depressed. You're going to think, I've been living a lie my whole life. You're going to be
Yeah.
disappointed. You're going to be angry. You're going to be
Yeah.
looking for someone to blame. But if you're never told that there's $10 million, you're going to live your life in a different way, and you're going to live more in the moment instead of waiting for this thing to come.
Yes.
And I started looking at my life that way. I started looking at it like with this real, honest, brutal honesty. What if there is nothing after death? What if once my father dies, my mother dies, I'm never going to see them again? I don't like it, but what if that's just the way things are? Instead of seeking comfort in something that I really don't know if is true or not, what if I just accept reality and make the most of it? And I think that was the real switch that led me to realize, okay, I'm not Muslim anymore. And when I realized I was not Muslim anymore is when the holy month of Ramadan came along, when I was, I think, 18, and I just didn't fast. And that was
Wow.
something I had been doing since I was a really young kid.
Did
But once
it
I stopped doing
feel
that,
good or did it feel scary? A little bit of everything? Did your parents know that you weren't fasting?
well, I was in Canada at the time, so they wouldn't have
Yeah,
been able
I
to know.
figured. Mhm.
It felt like a burden had been lifted from me, like this
Interesting.
like this thing that I'd been almost like I wouldn't call it an act, but like this foreign object that had been part of me had been released, and
Interesting.
I could just be,
And you could eat as well.
and I
You
could
could just
eat.
you could eat a
Yeah,
snack. Interesting.
exactly.
So it went from being kind of heavy and daunting to almost being a relief, to being like I was talking to somebody about this the other day. I feel like there's this common thing we hear about where when somebody is ill, maybe they have a long-term illness, maybe they're just old and their family has been caring for them for a long, long time, and then
Yeah,
that person passes away, the family almost feels guilty about how relieved they feel that they no longer have to take care of that person. Like, not that they didn't love them or that the person was a burden, but they just spent so much of their time and energy on that person that when that person finally passes away and it's done, it's over, they feel so relieved and they feel a little bit guilty. And I think that happens to a lot of religious people as
I
they're
think so
leaving
too.
religion.
Yeah,
You feel such a sense of relief that that old voice in your head from religion that makes you feel guilty about stuff that feels good is like, yeah, of course you would feel good, sinner, you hateful sinner going to hell. That's why that feels good. And so it's traumatic and relieving at the same time, but that's so interesting. And so once you were like, this, I'm never going back, you know, or are you at that point where you say, I'm never ever going back, or
yeah. I
never
knew
say
I knew
never?
at that point that there's no going back, because um, part of the process was because I'd scrutinized everything about my religion so much. I just saw all of I can't say all, but a lot of the common explanations of how Islam is known to be true, or the proofs for it, if you wanna
Yeah.
call it that. And I mean, just faith alone was not enough for me.
Yeah.
I couldn't just believe on faith, because I started realizing, well, you could believe a lot of things on faith, and what is motivating that faith, and how can that faith mislead you?
Right.
Because it
And
all
is
came
it
down to the
faith?
motivations.
Right. And there's faith, and then there's also blind gullibility. There's faith, like I truly believe this and I don't need evidence to believe this. And then there's I believe this out of fear, or I believe this out of the worry of what happens if I don't, or I believe this because, like in school, everybody else believes it and I don't want to be the
Yeah.
odd one out. And those are the things I truly think that keep people religious as opposed to actual belief. I think we would be surprised at how many people who claim they're believers don't actually, by definition, believe in that way.
I see your point, because I think a lot of people profess having faith, but then they have all these doubts and uncertainties and
Yes.
rationalizations that they're doing with themselves that they might not even talk about with anyone
Yeah.
else.
Yeah.
And so that's
Absolutely.
definitely a thing as well.
Yeah. Or
So
belief, I think, is the exposure to differing ideas and the ability to perceive those ideas and study them and look
huh,
into them, and still at the end of the day feeling like your original belief is belief. And that's not what we see happening. We see people being told, you can't read that, you can't watch that, that's devil stuff. When in reality, true belief would be, I've seen it, I've read it, I've heard it, and I still believe what I believe.
I completely agree with that. Yeah, like a thing in Islam is that they teach that you should be very critical and open to all perspectives, and so that was always talked about in school. But for example, when we talk about things like Christianity or about Islam itself, there's always this assumption built into everything that Islam is true, Christianity is off, like it's gone a
Yes.
lot of things wrong. So it's like you're open-minded, but the conclusion is inevitable because Islam is the truth.
Yes. Yes.
So in
Or
that
the
sense, it defeats
whole
its own purpose.
or the whole you are allowed to ask whatever questions you want. You can ask anything and we'll tell you. But if you have those questions, I wonder where those come from. Maybe those came from the devil. Yikes. So, I mean, you're allowed to ask whatever questions you want, but if you have that many questions, maybe you did something wrong. Maybe you're letting the devil in. And so then
It's a
you don't ask
weakness
the
in you.
questions. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a weakness in you, and so you suppress it.
Yep.
Yeah, the thing that I was taught was that the devil is always whispering in your ear, whispering,
Yes.
whispering, whispering. Yeah.
Yes.
Uh,
Interesting.
so, so what happened next was I eventually broached the subject with my parents. So this is, what did we use back then? I think it might have been Skype. So I'd be
That's
talking
a
to my parents
throwback.
on, yeah, yeah. I'd be talking to my parents on Skype, and and MSN. I used MSN as well. Yeah. So
Wow.
I'd be talking to my parents about this stuff, and I'd slowly and steadily leak more and more about my feelings about Islam and just test the waters until eventually I just told them I don't practice anymore. I don't believe anymore. And they were very accepting. They were very
Yeah.
supportive. I think I wouldn't say they were surprised because they knew about all my doubts and had heard me say things before. Uh, but I think they didn't fully understand the transformation that had happened within me and how much I had cut Islam out of my life. And what eventually happened was when we started talking about the subject of religion years later, when I was more comfortable talking about it with them, was I realized that my parents were not religious, like
That
almost at
explains why
all.
they're so accepting. Yeah.
Well, and it also explained their behavior when I was a kid, right? So
Yeah.
never praying, not knowing how to pray. Um, we
Interesting.
would do all the Muslim stuff. We had multiple copies of the Quran in our home, and yet it was mostly just an act. And I think it's connected to what we were discussing earlier about how much Islam is just connected to the culture. And
Yeah.
so I got angry. I got angry. I was like, why didn't you tell me how you actually felt about all of these things? Why would you move us to my brother and I, when we were so young and impressionable, to a Muslim country, and then allow us to take these Islamic education classes almost every day, let us be indoctrinated by the system, by these teachers telling us all these things? Why would you allow me to be afraid, so
Yeah.
afraid of hell when I was so
Yeah.
young? Now, in their defense, they didn't realize how afraid of hell I was.
Yeah.
But
They're
as
like,
we
listen.
discussed, they saw inklings. They saw inklings of it. Um, and I think they were stunned by how angry I was. And I think their answers were pretty revealing. So one of the things my mother told me was, we didn't want to tell you our full feelings about religion because you're young, impressionable, and you're going to a Muslim country, and we didn't want you blurting out, "Oh, I'm an atheist," just like my mommy in school, because that can I mean,
Touche.
yeah. So the good thing, at least about the United Arab Emirates and Dubai specifically, is it's more moderate than other Muslim countries. But there would be repercussions to that. I couldn't tell you what they are, but social ostracization and who knows what other kinds of things could,
Yeah.
follow from that.
Yeah.
The thing that really stuck with me was the second thing my mother said. She said, I thought you were too young to understand that there's no justice in the universe. That's how she worded it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she
Wow,
thought
that's
that
heavy.
13-year-old me just wouldn't be able to handle such a concept.
Yeah.
And I think I want to just tie that back to what I was saying earlier about the 30-year-old expecting $10 million. If
Yeah.
you're never taught that there is a potentially, perfect justice in the universe, which is what Allah of Islam supposedly would deliver or mete out, I wouldn't expect it and I wouldn't be disappointed. And so I think my parents were very, like, I mean, I completely understand their justifications, and
Hmm.
it was definitely coming from a place of love and, caring for us,
Yeah.
my brother and I. But I think what happened because of that was my brother and I replaced them with other people, our teachers in school, who we barely knew really, as these really important figures in our lives because we didn't trust our parents.
Yeah.
And we believed all these things just because my parents wanted to protect us.
Yeah. And
And
that's
the
scary
bill had to
too.
be paid eventually, and that's what happened.
Yeah. This idea that you are, in a sense, taught that you are, like you said, you felt like a better Muslim than your parents, and you felt like you couldn't go to them for help or with questions or things like that because you felt like you knew more than them. And that's so much to put on a kid. That's so much responsibility and fear. And then it's like it makes you wonder what other things you might not have talked to them about that you didn't even realize were connected to that, but are,
Right.
that.
Yeah.
And it's wild.
Yeah.
That's wild.
I still think
And
about that kind of stuff all the time. Yeah.
oh yeah. Oh yeah. The one thing I feel like that comes out after you leave a religion is when you randomly start remembering all the stuff you used to do that you had no idea was tied to religion until later on in life. You're like, "Oh my God. Oh yeah. Oh my. Yeah." And you just start to have these random memories, and part of you wants to laugh, and then the other part of you is like, "But what if I didn't get out?" What if I was still in that? Like, what if I didn't leave? That's pretty messed up, actually.
I sometimes wonder about this alternate reality, Aleem, who never left. What would he be like? Would he be married with 5 kids now? What would be the differences? It
Yeah,
would be very
yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
When I was in college, I was still that conservative Christian girl, and I
Mm.
remember thinking like, "Ew, it smells like weed in that apartment. There's probably bad people in there. They're probably really bad people." And now, like, I wish I could go back and be who I am now at the time, but I also
Ah,
recognize that we have to go through these journeys, and
exactly.
I wouldn't appreciate who I am right now if I didn't have all the cringe memories keeping me awake at night, ruining my sleep,
Yeah. Our scars define us. Yeah.
Yes.
They
Yeah,
make us who we
exactly.
are. Yeah.
Exactly.
So
And
I would
so
say that's when I started being an atheist.
yeah,
Yeah.
and you, like, called yourself an atheist, or were you
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
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 And what was, if you had to say the biggest change, that came after being an atheist that wasn't directly related to religion? So, like, maybe it wasn't stopping praying or stopping fasting. Was there anything else in your life that changed a lot that you realized had been impacted by your belief?
I think, like I was saying earlier, how this was like me leaving was the first stepping stone to finding myself.
Yeah.
I think that was when I started just really doing things because they meant a lot to me and because I wanted to do them instead of listening to whether it's my parents or society in general and what you're told you're supposed to do. So the field I'm in right now is journalism. I'm a
Oh,
writer
yeah.
primarily, and the prevailing wisdom in our society is those aren't things you should be doing. I think, like, there's some people would support it obviously, but the majority would say um, it's not the most lucrative profession. You should be going into a career that's lucrative and stable and has security and has potential for promotions and stuff. And writing is a fun thing to do as a side hobby, but it's a dangerous thing to do as a full-time job. Especially, I mean, we're on YouTube right now, and everyone's on social media. People aren't reading as much. People are just on TikTok and things like that. but I didn't care anymore. It's like, I
Yeah.
want to do this. This is what fulfills me. This is what I
Yeah.
love doing. And so I'm going to do it. And I stopped letting my own fears and the the judgments of others to impact me in that sense. And
Yeah.
so I would really say I started living my life for myself. And I just want to make a point here too, just talking about being an atheist. Like, it's not this thing that's going to solve all your life's problems. Like, I'm not saying that once I left, it's like everything is good, everything is solved, I know who I am. The
Right.
best way I would describe it is it's like the first necessary stuff of shedding all these things that are holding you back so you can start something new.
Yes. Yes.
That's the best way of looking at it. Like,
Yeah.
atheism isn't going to give you fulfillment in life. It's a stepping stone.
I just tell people being an atheist is the same as being a Christian in that I make all the same mistakes. I'm just not going to hell for it. That's the only difference. That's it. I'm the same person. I'm the same idiot. I'm not going to hell at the end. At the end.
It's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. And so when you look at kind of, I don't want to say like speaking out. Would you say speaking out against Islam, critiquing Islam? Do you have any goals in terms of what you want to do by critiquing Islam or speaking out against Islam? Or do you want to focus on other areas? Like, how important is it to you to get that message out there of your personal deconstruction?
So, how I eventually got into this whole arena of talking
Yeah.
about religion and Islam for the most part was because in my 20s, so I'm 33 right now, in my 20s, religion wasn't part of my life anymore.
Mm,
But I found myself continually fixated on it. Like, I still read stuff about religion, critiques of religion. This is where I started learning more about the viewpoints of people like Christopher Hitchens, Sam
mhm.
Harris, and I discovered the atheist experience. And I would devour those things. I watched so many episodes of the atheist experience.
Same.
I saw Matt Dillahunty yelling at so many people.
Same.
um, and I remember there was this one time I had a close friend, and I was just talking about religion and how I can't remember what the specific detail was, but I was talking about how this one religion was causing all these people to do these harmful things. And she just snapped at me and said, like, why are you always talking about this stuff? And I realized I am always talking about it, even though I'm not religious anymore.
Yeah. Yep.
And
Yep.
one of the things I get as a recurring comment, let's say constructive criticism or feedback from religious people on my YouTube channel, is why are you? If you're an ex-Muslim, why are you so fixated on Islam? You're like someone who's obsessed with their ex. This is like the joke that comes up over and over again.
That's funny.
Yeah, and I think from their perspective, they think it's because I have unresolved issues with it, that I hate God. I don't know if you've ever seen God's Not Dead, which
Yeah.
to anyone watching, I highly recommend you watch that movie. It's a fascinating insight into the conservative Christian mindset.
Yes.
So they frame you as, I just hate religion. I blame God for all the problems in my life. So I secretly still believe, but I'm just angry.
Yes.
But here's the thing. I started thinking, why am I so fixated on it? And I realized it's because religion is this thing that attempts to answer the biggest questions in life in a way that no other arena, maybe you could say philosophy sort of does, but nothing else really comes close to it.
Yeah.
And it's the underpinning of so many people's worldviews, their
Yes.
foundation.
Mhm.
And I could see just from my own experience and just seeing the experience of other people who had left Islam and seeing the anecdotes shared by people on Matt Dillahunty's channel, on the atheist experience, um, I saw the huge impacts that religion has, even though we're supposedly becoming more of a secular world.
Mhm.
And when it comes to the subject of Islam, there's this thing where critiquing Islam, especially if someone looking like you was critiquing Islam, is perceived as Islamophobia. It's a hateful attack. It's something that's nothing to do with the religion. It's just hating these people because of where they come from. And I saw that me as an Arab, someone who used to be Muslim, is someone who can speak to the subject of Islam and the problems with it in a way that other people can't. So I felt like this responsibility to do so because I'm
Yeah.
also living in Canada and I'm able to freely speak in ways that a lot of people can't.
Yeah.
There's so many stories of ex-Muslims who hide that they've left the religion because of the country that they're living in,
Yeah.
or they've been jailed for a tweet, or for participating in a protest, or doing all sorts of things that are questioning the authority of the religion.
Yeah.
I don't have to worry about those things. I don't have to
Right.
worry about being stabbed in the street, which is something a lot of ex-Muslims look at the case
Yes.
of Salman Rushdie, what happened to him in the US of all places.
Yes.
Uh, so I felt this responsibility.
Yeah.
And I figured a great way of reaching out to people was social media.
Hmm.
And that's what kind of got me going in there, because I just really wanted to share a perspective, someone who used to be a believer, and share why I stopped believing, and kind of let people come
Sure.
to their own conclusions.
Sure. Sure. And I too have heard the same thing about like, you're not even religious. Why are you so obsessed with religion? And my question is, why would we not be? Why would we
Mhm.
not be? You think something religious people like to say is, "Oh, religion isn't harming anyone. It's not harming anyone. Just don't believe it. Leave it alone. Leave us alone, and everybody's good." But it is harming so many people, and it's harming so many facets of our lives and our cultures that we don't even realize are connected. For example, evangelical Christianity. Evangelical Christianity is one, it's harmful because it poses this everything is your fault, everything is in your hands. If you don't have a personal relationship with God, it's because you sinned, you're not praying enough. So you've already got this guilt, and I know that that same guilt spans across many religions and many cultures, but also, for example, religions that emphasize, no sex before marriage, they are directly correlating themselves with the percentage of abusive marriages and relationships and the percentage of failed marriages and relationships. Because when you have never had sex with anybody, you have no idea what kind of sexual, physical compatibility you have with your spouse. You don't know what's normal. You don't know what's healthy. You don't know any of that stuff. So you go into these relationships and you're not compatible in any way, especially not that way, but you've never even been allowed to be alone together in some cultures. And now you're just supposed to have a bunch of kids with this person. It's just so you're a slut if you have sex outside of marriage, but if you sign a piece of paper, then you're no longer a slut. You're just supposed to be giving us as many kids as possible. That's the way that God wants it. And so when people say, why are you obsessed with it? Why would I not be? If our laws were based on the story of Snow White, people would be freaking out. They'd be like, this is a story. It's not true. There's nothing to base these claims off of. But because the story is the Bible or the Quran or any of these other religious texts, people are like, yeah, that checks out. And I'm like, that checks out? You don't need any proof whatsoever to change the laws in our country, to change the social norms. You don't need any proof at all. You don't even want to see receipts. To me, that's crazy. So yes, I am obsessed with it. I'm very similar. It's like I am the one person who's always talking about it because it's always here. It's not going anywhere. If it goes away, I'll stop talking about it. But until then, I'm going to wake up every day shook to the core that everyone's just walking around letting a fictitious work of, not even, I wouldn't even say creative nonfiction, because more of it is not true than is true. And people can just say, well, you sound like you're obsessed with your ex. It's like, well, if my ex were causing as many problems as religion were, I'd probably still be talking about them too, you know?
Yeah, imagine if your ex is supposed to be this invisible, all-powerful entity that controls everything. Yeah, I'd
Yeah.
probably be
If my
obsessed with them too.
if my ex was directly related to the deaths of millions of people via genocide because they didn't follow what my ex said to do, I'd probably still be talking about it. Just wild. Just
Yeah,
wild.
it really connects to that whole thing that you were saying earlier about how um, I think people just don't realize how much religion influences behaviors and
Mhm.
decisions on a
Mhm.
day-to-day basis. And I think that just comes from honestly a place of I wouldn't say ignorance in the sense of, oh, you're idiots. It's just not really thinking about it,
Having
not
no
taking the
idea.
time to make those connections, because they really do exist. You gave Rick a really good
Yeah.
example when it comes to marriage, but there's like endless examples.
Yeah.
And how can it not, if you think about it? This is the thing that is you're taught is the most important thing in life. You're supposed to serve God. You're supposed to do the will of God. And it's the foundation of your life. Obviously, it's going to impact all of your decisions. And especially here in countries like Canada and the US, there's this prevailing wisdom that, well, religion has its domain, and then there's the domain of day-to-day life. But they're so interconnected when so many of us are religious and practicing.
Yeah.
We can't really separate them in that sense.
Right. And also, why would you not talk about it all day, every day, when you're one of the few people in this world that have the privilege to be able to sit here and talk about this and post it on the internet and not go to jail for life? You know, that's another thing is even in Western cultures, you know, in Canada and America, people are still ostracized from their family, beat up by family members. I've still hear about religion related murders, you know, honor killings and things like that. And people like you and I, we have the privilege of sitting here having a conversation, and then we're going to hang up and probably, you know, read a book, watch some Netflix. I'm going to go hang out with my birds, like not a problem. When there are people in other countries who are either doing this and then hiding or serving time in prison or missing because they made a TikTok about how they don't believe in God anymore and now they're dead. And for people to say, "Oh, you sound like you're obsessed." Yes. Yes. Like I am, I will be the crazy friend who's always talking about how wild religion is until people stop dying because of religion. It's wild.
Couldn't have said it better myself. I
Thank
think
you.
there's like a lot of things that if I was to say I want to just take forward, like especially with conversations like this, and one of the things I really admire about your channel is that you also talk to religious people, which I think is super important,
Mhm.
is just opening people's minds to perspectives that are different than their own. Because
Right.
I think it really does come down to what I was saying earlier, that it just doesn't occur to people to ask these questions or to look at things from this perspective. When I was
Right.
Muslim, when I was 17, 18, I didn't even realize there was a thing called an ex-Muslim. I didn't realize there was a possibility of just leaving and then living your life. I just thought this is how you live. This is how you live your life. And so what I think really needs to be done is not going into people's faces and saying you're stupid, you're a
No.
moron for believing. It's just asking the right questions,
Yeah.
questions that maybe they've never been asked before, and get them thinking. And I
Yeah.
always wonder, like, what is the impact of what I've been doing? I've had this channel, my YouTube channel, which is called Secular Spirit, for 2 years. The main subject is Islam, but I really intended it to be something that looks at spirituality in general.
Mhm.
And I don't know how many people it's reached really, and who knows how many of those people actually will change their minds after having viewed a video of mine or a video of yours. But I think it's all part of this whole process of
Yeah.
engaging and starting those conversations and asking those questions. I think we're so obsessed with having, I think this is just us as a species. We're obsessed with having explanations and answers for everything. And there's this big discomfort with saying, I don't know. I've heard it time and time again from religious people where they say, well, Christianity has the best explanation for me. That's not to say that it's the correct answer.
Right.
And just to say some explanation is better than nothing, I think is also something that really needs to be re-examined.
Totally.
And just that kind of framing is something that I think a lot of religious people wouldn't even think about.
Right. And I think also delivery like yours and channels like yours, they're so important because, you know, we do have the Matt Dillahunties of the world, you know, who come out swinging, but I think religion is very much like losing weight or any other big major changes, you know, quitting drugs. It has to be that person's decision. It
It has to come
has
from
to.
within.
Yes. And you can sit here and you can yell and you can holler and you can call them dumb and you can say whatever you think is going to get in their head. But from personal experience, what that does is that makes them retreat further back into their religious beliefs because why would they want to be like somebody so angry? You know, why would they want to be so mad all the time? And so while I think there was a place for delivery, very much like Matt's, you know, where he's just sick and tired of talking to people who are arguing with him all the
Yeah.
time, I think there's just as much a place for channels like yours where, like you said, it's not about looking somebody in the face and telling them what they're doing wrong. It's about asking them a question that's going to stick with them for a long time. And maybe they've only watched one of your videos, but maybe in that video you asked one question they've never forgotten, and they've since watched other videos or read other things or moved on. Maybe they don't even spend that much time on YouTube anymore, but they've never forgotten that question that you asked, and they've never stopped thinking about what their answer is to that question or what that means. And as you said, that's just a small step in somebody's entire deconstruction story, but it's an important step. It's a big one.
Yeah, and believe it or not, I mean, I get a lot of formerly religious people who reach out to me on Twitter or Instagram. They just want someone to talk to, someone to share their experiences with. I get a lot of religious people who reach out to me and who continue reaching out to me, even if we reach an impasse or we just agree to disagree, but they still come back to me. And
Yeah.
I remember thinking, why is that? And one of my theories that I've developed recently is because they have this itch that they can't scratch. And me, like, contacting me is some way of them itching that scratch, whether it's um, poking holes at their own beliefs because they feel that something is off, or because they know something is off. And so they just want to put me down to just prove themselves right. I think I've experienced both.
They know you can
But it
handle
is
it.
there. Yeah,
Yeah.
there is something there. And I think it really is just talking to people in a way that they haven't been talked to before, and asking the right questions. I mean, we could do the Dillahunty approach. My favorite thing he used to do was, if someone was just talking and not stopping, he'd just say, "Idiot, idiot," just
Yes.
repeat "idiot." I mean, it's funny in the
Yeah.
moment, and I guess
Yes.
it is good entertainment, but
Yeah.
I don't think much positivity comes out of that kind of
Right.
interaction.
Right. Exactly. It's like, when you go to his content, you know exactly what you're looking for. Like you know exactly what type of
Yeah,
content that's going to be. And if that's not for you, I think it's important to have other approaches and types of content out there. There's the content we go to watch just to have a laugh, and then there's the content that very similarly is like a conversation, or just asking questions, or just kind of breaking something down in a way that isn't scary,
yeah,
because very much like you were saying, you get reached out to by religious people, um in a similar fashion. I don't think that religious people are stupid. I don't think that people who follow God, to whatever context they do, or within whatever religion they believe in, I don't think they're stupid. I think they've just been robbed of the opportunity to explore other options and other answers. And I don't pity them. I don't look at people like that with pity, but I would love to offer them that perspective, that opportunity. And I think your channel does the same thing, where it's like, I don't think you're stupid, but I would love for you to come to some new realization after having watched a video of ours, whether it's you immediately wake up the next morning and you're an atheist, or it takes you another 15 years. That, I think, is just such an important step, and such an interesting thing to get to do and be a part of. And to your point, not even know how many people might have been impacted by it, but
yeah.
wondering all the time who might have been.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like, I always try to connect things also to just going back to other perspectives. One of my recent videos that I did was, I just had this idea. What if there's all this buzz around ChatGPT these days? Well, what if I asked ChatGPT to invent a religion for me? And so I did.
Oh.
And it came up with this whole, it was kind of fascinating actually. It came up with this whole, I would say, pretty comprehensive self-contained religion that revolved around the internet. It was called the Digital Pantheon, and it had deities like there's a technomancer and hacktivist, the god of hacking, and it had this whole ethos on how to live a good life as well, and a view on the afterlife. And my goal with that, it was just to show how, if you're a Christian, if you're a Muslim, you really believe that your religion is the truth. It's the one true thing. But then once you see that there's these other religions, and that I can make up a religion like this, that there's a formula, there's these things that are recurring themes, and there is this belief I among some religious people that these recurring themes are actually true, the proof that there's some kind of universal truth to them. But instead of looking at it that way, what about looking at it as, well, there's these things we need, and there's these needs that religions take care of. So what are we sacrificing to get those needs, and can we get those needs fulfilled without the religion? So those are, I think, very interesting questions to ask if you're a religious person, and if you're not religious too.
Yeah, definitely. I will say I never debate. I was in debate for years on a team, and I given up debate. But on the rare occasion, that I accidentally find myself in like a debate style conversation, maybe it's petty. I love asking people if they believe in the Greek or the Roman gods. And they're like, "What?" And I'm like, do you believe in Zeus?" And they're like, "Of course I don't believe in Zeus." And I'm like, "Why?" And they're like, "Cuz that is utterly ridiculous." And I'm like, "Why?" And they're like, like a god in the clouds, like throwing lightning who just makes decisions and he's like angry." And I'm like, "Yeah, that sounds ridiculous, doesn't it?"
Waiting for the ball to drop.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're like, keep going. That's just I do love that moment. I don't like to do those types of conversations, but every once in a while, just hearing the way people describe other religions that they are so sure is false, and the reasons they find it false, and not putting together that those exact same reasons apply
Yeah.
to their religion. But
And it really
um,
comes down to just time, right? It's like if a
definitely.
religion's been around for centuries and millennia, I think the side effect of that, beyond it just like seeming like something more important because it's old, it's that all these people over all these generations have overthought everything about it. I mean, I remember watching this video of someone like a Christian trying to explain the trilogy, and it just blew my mind. Sorry, the Trinity, not the trilogy.
I didn't even know. That's hilarious. I wanted to be the trilogy now. I didn't even realize the mistake there. That's great.
The trilogy of the Trinity. Yeah.
So you got your father, and then you got your son, who's also your father, and then you got your Holy Spirit, who's also your son and your father at the same time, and he was born of a virgin. So just
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
what
just
that is. Yeah.
and you have to believe that, or else the whole thing falls apart. Apparently,
But you do have free will. You don't,
of
but you
course.
do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Aleem, I want to be respectful of your time, but if you had just like a last message or takeaway for somebody who's watching this, maybe they're still religious, maybe they're not, maybe they're deconstructing, they're not sure. What would you say to somebody who's listening to this episode?
I think the best thing to do is what I guess we've been talking about this whole episode is to just keep an open mind and be skeptical. Like re-examine the things that you've always taken for granted. And I don't just mean that when it comes to religion. I think in any part of your life, and listen to what other people have said in the past, people who you maybe disagreed with in the past as well, and try to see where they're coming from. I think in society today we have this big problem where we listen to ourselves and we listen to people we already agree with, but
Yes,
there are things to learn from people we disagree with. That doesn't mean we have to agree
totally.
with them,
Right.
but let's say you're someone who's a more progressive. There's things to learn from listening to a Trump supporter, because you learn where they're coming from. You
Yes.
learn where that perspective what is motivating that perspective. And when you learn more about all these things, they help inform what you believe, because you re-examine them from all these different perspectives. It's as simple as that.
Yes. I could not agree more. Exposing yourself to people that you don't agree with, I think is one of the best things that a human being can do. And I think not exposing yourself to people you disagree with because you don't like hearing what they have to say is a lot of how religion has been so successful all over the world, is because you cut out all those opposing opinions and thoughts
Mhm.
and you only stick to your own fishbowl. And even if you still want to be a religious person, it's so important that you know why, and that you know you have answers and you have reasons, and you've exposed yourself to people who disagree with you, and you at least have a response in mind for why it is that you believe these things other than somebody told you to. So I think that's wonderful advice. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah,
Well,
thank
Aleem,
you.
thank you.
Glad you agree.
Yeah. Well, oh, dadgummit, I agree with you. Now I have to stop talking to you. I have to go find somebody I disagree with to follow my own advice.
Exactly.
But Aleem, I so much appreciate your time and your story. And for anybody listening, I'm gonna link Aleem's channel in the description, and as well as your Twitter account, and I believe one other channel as well that you've told me
Yes.
about. I'll link
Yes.
below as
Whether
well.
you're someone who's a former Muslim or If you're an atheist, just in general, I highly recommend a channel of a good friend of mine who's also an ex-Muslim. His name's Apostate Aladin. I do my channel as a side thing. He's doing it full time, and if you really want to learn the perspective of an ex-Muslim, that's a great place to start.